Juanita.
Mhm.
It's always a joy and privilege to have you back on the show. I think you're one of the persons I've most cited in all the episodes.
Oh, thank you. I'm so glad to be here. What I've experienced with you is you're always so thoughtful and curious, and I just think we need more of that in the world.
Mm,
Thank you for the work you're doing.
take this as a compliment. Thank you. And I always perceive the conversations with you as deeply nurturing and helping me to ground into what's actually relevant, beyond all the buzz, to come back to self and to purpose and meaning and spirituality.
Mm, thank you.
And yeah, so being here right now, what's alive for you as a facilitator, as a wisdom keeper?
Mm. I think one of the things that's alive for me, if I take those in order as a facilitator, is that we have become such a culture of imitation instead of integration of the work. We know all the right words to say, we know all the ways to move, but it's like we don't embody it. Maybe that's the absence of the balance of the masculine and the feminine. The masculine that holds the container and the feminine that goes in and embodies and helps to deepen it into, so it becomes a part of you. Um,
And is this because we are rushing too much and because I wonder whether it's because it's too easy. It become too easy to actually absorb all the language and to imitate. And
yes.
we are too busy to actually sit with it so that we can eventually embody.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's because we live in such a microwave culture. And so, we want to microwave our healing too. And so we're also attracted to the flashy
Mm,
because, we want to be with people who will let us do that and who won't stop and say, oh, no, no, you need to sit here a little bit longer. I host and facilitate a 16-month leadership rites of passage cohort for adults. And, it's an initiatory journey. And I think about people who are hosting similar things for 3 months. you know, like we can be initiated, and not that, and even after the 16 months, I tell the people in Fire and Water, this is just the beginning,
mm.
because it's a crumbling that happens in your system, and you need to be held in that in a kind way. And if you're really doing that deep dive, 3 months ain't gonna do it. But we like that somebody can tell us that we can, and then
Mm.
we can feel like then we got it, you know? Mm.
Feels like needing the stamp, the permission, the label instead of
Yes.
the achievement.
Yes.
Or, and
Wanting
what
the
might,
certificate. you know?
yeah, officially grown up.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
recently heard that phrase and I read it in a book and I found it hilarious. Nobody ever told us that we don't stop growing up. We somehow
Yeah.
all believe that when we're 18, oh, now we're adults.
Yes. Yes.
We never stop growing up.
We just have a bunch of adolescent adults, you
Yeah.
know, because just because you're in big people's body doesn't mean you're a grown up.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah.
So, what is it that takes so long?
Hmm. Because if it didn't, oh my goodness, it would be quite a trauma on the, it's already traumatic, I think, the initiation process. But I think it's because what you're doing is letting go of old beliefs. And there's usually a space in between. We have 3 retreats in the 16 months, and the middle retreat I call the medicine retreat. And it's really where the crumble, it's like you're in the middle of the crumble. These things that you've held on to as being right, real, and true are starting to fall apart.
Mm.
And there's deep grief and sadness in that to be held in. And then what happens is at the same time, or usually there's a little bit of a space, but at the same time, there's a birthing of something. There's the hospicing out the old and the birthing, midwifing the new.
Mm. Because there's suddenly space.
Yes. There's space for it to come in.
Yeah.
You know, we say oftentimes there's lots of things that we want, but we're too full to have it. You have
Mm.
to empty out the stuff you don't want so that there's room for the new stuff to come in.
Why is it so scary to let go of the old stuff, to the old beliefs that no longer serve us?
Yeah. I think part of it is because we've lost the understanding and the importance of elders. You know, we can't take ourselves someplace we haven't been. And the gift of elders is that they can see themselves. So, of course, they can see you and hold space for you and put you first. They're
Mm.
not just old people. And in that process, if you don't trust people to be able to do that, if you don't trust that somebody else can put you first and hold space for you, you'll never go to the bottom of your grief and your depth
Mm.
and empty out to get access to the gifts of the wound.
It actually makes me sad to hear that. Because I think it's something that we would hope that every person, every adult has experienced, to be seen and held by someone so that we can fully be ourselves. Um, and by own experience, I know that it's not quite so many tears on the
Yeah,
grief,
yeah,
not having the past that I would like to have.
yeah. There's a woman, her name is Rita Fierro, and she wrote a book. I believe it's titled Digging Up the Seeds of White Supremacy.
Mm.
And one of the things she talks about as a white woman, she says, we have been birthed into being tools of the patriarchy. And so the threat in the family is always, if you don't stay in line, you'll be disinherited, you'll be kicked out. And she's like, so we don't always trust that our parents love us.
Mhm.
And she says, people of color often, no matter how messy their families are, they usually trust that their parents love them. And so there's this piece that if you don't have that and didn't trust that with your parents, how can you surrender to an elder?
Yeah,
You know?
that's a very interesting distinction. Yeah.
To me, I've noticed like in the it's curious because I thought it would be the opposite in the rites of passage program. I thought that people of color would struggle more with the eldering piece and that white people would struggle more with the communal piece. But it actually has been the opposite.
Mm.
The people of color, because we're such a very communal culture, but because our initiation process is a multicultural initiation process, you know, we were stuck with this whole question of like, if initiation typically happens culturally specific, how do you do a diverse culturally specific initiation? So what we've done is we use ancestral DNA. Every person who comes in gets a DNA kit.
What does it
And
mean?
so that they can look at their own ancestral DNA and
Oh,
decide,
literal DNA.
yes,
To
literal
look
DNA
all the pieces and parts there.
of themselves. So
Wow.
then they can decide which part of their lineage they want to dive deeper into. Because we've lost the understanding too that we're connected to people before us and after us. And that we have this long history that gets woven in our own DNA. And so then what happens is we can dive deeper into our own ancestral DNA side by side. Because
Mm.
we are a culture, a multicultural culture. That is the culture we are a part of. Yeah.
Yeah, fascinating. And when you say initiation,
Yes.
um, you're using a few words, and I have the impression that if I don't ask what you mean by them, we might lose parts of the meaning of your
Yeah.
words. And initiation is one of them.
Yes. And there's lots of initiations that we go through in our lifetime. There's the initiation of being born. There's the initiation of like the terrible twos we talk about. There's a concept where you start getting that I, my own personal
The
stuff.
ego.
There's an initiation point that's like around 7 or 8 and growing into your girlhood or your boyhood. Our family had initiation, that when you turn, I think it was 12, you got your own laundry basket. Something like that, right? There's all kinds of
You do it yourself now.
exactly, exactly. So there's all kinds of different initiations in our life. The initiation that I'm speaking about is this adolescent moving from adolescent to adult. So many of us get stuck in this adolescent adult space. We're in these grown people bodies, so we think we've grown up, but we haven't grown in our own. What I think is asked of us at initiation is that we move from being earth led in our decision making to being spiritual led in our decision making. And that
Mm.
doesn't mean that you ignore the earthly pieces, because we are divine beings and human beings. We're in these human bodies. It's that we lead with a kind of the upper part of the heart chakra and upwards. We lead from a more our spiritual selves than our human selves.
Which means, okay, so there are a few, there's so much to
Yes.
unpack. One piece that I find interesting is that the initiations you cited before maybe the final one, or the final one that you cited, are all done to you or led by biology.
Yes.
Around age of 2, it happens to almost all children, unless there is a dysfunction to find
Yes.
the ego and the I.
Yes.
And then there is the puberty, the
Yes.
biological, physiological change of the body. And then suddenly there is then the maturity that is must be initiated by ourselves.
Yes.
We have to want in
Well,
order to get into adulthood.
well, now we do, but I think a lot of cultures have had initiatory processes in them. When your culture loses that, one of the things Melodoma Somé, he had said was that when we're not initiating the youth, they will burn down the village just to feel its warmth, because the soul knows it has to be initiated. And so he says in the West, we've chosen to do initiation mostly through trauma. We'll do it through illness, we'll do it through all kinds of stuff because we don't have these processes set up.
Where we have to grow up and to stand up for ourselves.
Yes.
And
And,
then,
and oftentimes we don't do them. So we get this traumatic experience and we don't grow up, right? And I think part of it, if you're looking at like, I love Carol Pearson's work on the heroine within and the hero's journey, because what she talks about is the first process of, a lot of us know the hero's journey, the departure or the preparation is actually a journey of the ego.
mhm,
It's, do you have a strong enough ego to be in this world and not of it, right? It's that
mhm.
piece about not, because so often when we talk about ego, we're just talking about shadow ego, but ego isn't just shadow. There's a German story about this German town that figured out how to trap the ego in a box. And what they found is there were no more celebrations of births or birthdays, no businesses opened, no like these things, no anniversaries celebrated, no weddings, because you have to have the light side of the ego to be able to see those things as important. And so they decided to let it go and experience all of what the ego brings.
That's beautiful. Because I think that, and that's something that I had to experience rather late in my life. That in order to love, we have to start with self-love.
Yes. Because you can't give something you don't have,
Exactly. And
Yes.
then, so we do need ego because it's a deep sense of self. And if we don't have
Yes.
this deep sense of self, how can we feel compassion to others?
Yeah. Yeah. And I will say, so that first part of preparation is the ego stuff. And oftentimes when we're there, we'll go to see a therapist. And the
Mm.
therapist's job is to try to help us get, okay with our job or okay with our spouse or okay with our life, right? It's the physical, the earthly stuff, right?
Mhm.
Um, Spirit doesn't care about those things. Spirit doesn't care if you lose your job or if your marriage falls apart. Spirit just wants your soul to meet itself. And so then what happens is in the journey itself, in the middle of the journey, there's this crumbling. And that's what we avoid because we're afraid of what we'll have to give up for the new person or the new person that we're to step into.
And that's when we hang on to our
Yes.
beliefs, to our,
Yes.
yeah,
Yep. And if you don't have a strong enough ego from that beginning, you can't make it through the soul's journey completely. You like start to go and then you go back, right? Because you don't have it. You can't stand in that space of crumble and then the finding the new.
because then you don't have anything to rely on and to
Yeah,
fall
because you have to
back to.
surrender.
Yeah.
You have to surrender and know that it's not all about you. That because we are spiritual beings having a human experience and not the other way around, human beings who sometimes have spiritual ones,
So you've
then
got to. Mm.
what happens is that we have to surrender. We're in a relationship with the divine, whatever that means to you. We don't get to decide all of the particulars.
And this sounds like a very, like a calling. So you have then this strong sense of you know what you've got to do, basically.
Well, I think what it does is it starts to get us. um, I think on the journey where we know more. It's not a one and done. It's not like once you've been through that initiation, you know everything. It's an ongoing relationship with yourself. And your soul so desperately wants to meet itself. And then what happens is in the return of the journey, it actually so the journey itself is the journey of the soul. The return of the journey is the journey of the self. It's where you start to decide, oh, now that I know these things about me, what is it that I want? What is it am I calling for? I have a Native American medicine woman friend who I was talking to last year. We were talking on the phone, and she said to me at the end of our phone call, she says, you know, you can go after all that you want. And the ancestors say that they'll provide all that you need. And all that you need is bigger than your wildest dreams.
Mm.
And I said, okay, wait a minute, you got to say that again. Because I was like, I have to like let that soak into me. Because she said it again. And I said, I always thought what was bigger than my wildest dreams is what I wanted, not what I needed, and that they'll provide bigger than my wildest dreams. So why do I block that?
Mm.
And what I realize is because unconsciously, I think we know that bigger than our wildest dreams is connected to what we've promised to do this lifetime. And often I just don't want that responsibility. And so I avoid or I sabotage the blessings coming in because I know that it comes with responsibility. And that's the growing up.
The growing up in the sense to stand up to the responsibility and to be ready for it.
Yes, to accept what's yours. Maya Angelou said that, actually, she says, modesty and humility are two very different things. She says, modesty will fall off quicker than a G string on a stripper. She says, but real humility says, somebody else paved the way for me. Now it's
Mm.
my turn to pave the way for someone else.
Mm.
That's the responsibility.
And then it's growing beyond the ego. So it's
Yes.
first finding and growing the ego and
Yes.
then going beyond, if I understand you.
Yeah, and mostly because like I think about, what I feel called to do as opposed to so often I think we're told that our passion is our calling, and I don't think that's true. I think often our calling are things that we don't want to do.
Hmm.
We can do them with our passion, but our calling, and I think it's purposeful that there are things we don't want to do because I think that it keeps our ego out of it when we don't want to do it. I can have conversations with people. There's jobs that I know. There's one job that I got that they came to me and two other people and asked us to put a proposal together. And it wasn't a real proposal. It was like, what's your philosophy? How much money will you charge us? Are you ready on these dates? And I remember, and it was training like 150 people in circle. And I remember praying that I wouldn't get it because I just didn't want to do it. And then what happened is the space had some like layoffs. They like laid off almost a third of their people and then created like that many more new jobs. And then I knew before they even reached back out to me, oh crap, it's me. Because part of what I bring is not only the hosting of what they were looking for, but also grief. And what they just were walking into was this grief that was created. You know, there was one person there who said that she was had such survivor's guilt. On her team, she was the only one left, you know? And so that was mine to do, even though I didn't want to do it, you know, but I'm obedient. And so when I interview her, when I do, I can be clear and honest because I'm not attached to whether or not they say, yes, we want you.
And I'm curious in two things. One is why you didn't want to do it. Was it
Yeah.
was it self-sabotage? Was it that you
No, I'll tell
felt
you why I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to do it because I'm a survivor. And one of the things that makes me really good at what I do is that I can feel where everybody is in the room. And I can know kind of like the next movement that I need to do to hold everybody and where everybody is. This was a group of 150 people. Once it gets past a certain number, I can't feel everybody. And
mm,
so I start to not feel safe. But I know it's not true. I just feel, I mean, it's just part of my own history.
mhm.
And you know, and I got there and I feel that way beforehand, but when I got there, I know what to do. I know how to do my job and what I'm called to do. And so I wasn't afraid when I was there. I just got afraid thinking about being there, which so I have to know that about myself too.
And
Because safety isn't external, safety is internal.
thank you. And I'm glad that I asked the question because I think when we speak about healing, um, that's what we often forget what it actually means. So to recognize when you do have what's the impact of your past trauma,
Yeah.
to recognize your trauma response, and then in your case to distinguish, okay, this is my body believing that it's still real
Yeah.
and choosing to do it anyway, which is then, yeah, growth, maturity, or courage, whatever you want to call it.
Well, one of the things I love that you brought the word courage up because I was with a friend and she had just given a speech one day on courage. And she said for the first time she saw the word courage and saw the word rage in it
Mm,
and realized that every courageous act has a bit of rage in it. And
mm,
that made me think of Iron John, his Robert Bly's book, where he talks about, he says, anger is personal, rage is communal, it's archetypal. And it made me think, what if courage by definition is archetypal? And so I started like just, you know, the way things work with me, they just kind of work me. And so I'm thinking about this. I'm traveling, and about four people told me on this particular trip, well, you know, the beginning of courage core is heart rage.
mm.
And so then James Hillman writes about the three different philosophies of the heart. He talks about how it's the physical heart, the blood pumping heart. He talks about the passionate heart, what pulls us from the inside out. And he talks about the essence or the heart of the matter, right? The essence of something. And so I started to think, what if when we choose and act courageous, what we're really doing is stepping out of a personal fear into honoring a collective truth. And
Mm.
with knowing that, help us to choose courage more often when we really got that it isn't just about us. And when we choose and act courageous, maybe it just heals all three of those pieces of our hearts at the same time.
Mm, I love that. Because without fear, we wouldn't need to be courageous in the first place.
Yes.
And
And,
yeah,
and I also think, anger is unprocessed personal grief,
mm,
and rage is unprocessed communal grief. And so sometimes when that rage comes up, we have to know it feels different in the body when we're angry than when we're enraged. And so to know like that enragement requires community. Sabang Fusome said that we are wounded in community, and so the healing has to happen there too.
and I think that's something that is currently going wrong on so many levels that we see all this anger and rage going on.
Yes.
And the only way to go past that is to dig deeper to see what lays beyond. And I
Yes.
would be curious what you mean by grief, because I would add that beyond the anger can also be fear.
Hmm.
And I would see fear differently than grief.
Well, I think fear doesn't ever exist in the present moment. Fear always exists in the past or the future. When I'm in the present moment, I'm never afraid. Fear is, I can be afraid of what might happen, or I can be
Mhm.
afraid of what has happened in the past. But usually in that present moment, it's not fear. It may be pain in that moment because something's happening, but it's not fear,
Hmm. Hmm.
And so part of it is knowing that fear doesn't exist in the present moment. If you're feeling afraid, the thing to do is get really present.
This makes a lot of sense. And hence, beyond anger or rage must be something else than
Yeah.
fear, and that's then grief.
Yes.
And
Yes. I think it's, I think like one of the things, so I have wonderful elders in my life. And one of the elders is Fan Shan Shure, who's this diva, shaman, dancer, Jewish woman who who I said I've met so she could teach me audacity, and one of the things that she's taught me, and I really believe this to be true, shame, blame, and guilt are not emotions. They're actually where we go to hide from emotions.
mm,
And the emotion is usually just deep grief and sadness. And, we like instead of so often we'll take the shame, blame, or guilt instead of taking responsibility.
mhm,
But real responsibility just means the ability to respond. That if you're in it, you hold a piece of that. And so this piece around like, every time I hear in a room the shame, blame, or guilt come up, I ask the question, what are you trying not to feel? To help us, because it actually it gets us stuck when we're
yeah,
holding on to the shame, blame, and guilt.
yeah. And I had that recently actually with my girlfriend. I was so angry. So I called her whether I could rant for a while.
Yes.
So we had a video call and I went, I'm so angry, I'm so angry. I'm very good at anger. That's the emotion in my family
Yeah.
that was absolutely okay instead
Yeah.
of sadness, or
Yes.
these weak emotions. So as I was ranting, she then looked at me and said, do I see fear in your face? What do you mean? And as I calmed down and connected to the fear and connected to the emotions, that's what I saw. The fear
Yeah.
of all different kinds of situations that I projected in my mind.
Yes.
And to just suppress these, I became angry at this other person. And the moment where I could connect to my own, where I could own my response, and the fear or maybe the sadness
Yes.
around it, um, I could reach out with compassion and
Mm,
heal the situation. which was amazing
Yeah.
actually um, to realize that.
Yeah. I think one of the things is I think fear is also a developmental thing.
Mhm.
When we're little kids and we're trying to learn how to walk, it's good to have a little bit of fear, to like, so we don't like fall on our face and all that, right? To like, but I think as we grow up, hopefully we're not paying attention to every step we're making now, you know? And I think there's a point where fear turns into an invitation,
Mm.
there, and as we grow older to surrender that and be invited into, you
Mm.
know, so like, what's the invitation in those moments?
And on the other side of fear is usually growth.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. I'm at a point where most of the time, like if I'm afraid, I'm probably more likely to do it than not.
Mm.
Because I know as I've grown, I'm not afraid of little shit anymore. So if it's showing up and I'm afraid, it's because the ego is trying to hold on.
Because you care.
Yes.
Something is at stake.
Yes. And so something's trying to grow in me. And the shadow ego doesn't want to let go because it knows that change is coming if I do this.
Mm.
And so that's why I can be afraid and do it anyway.
There was something you said, and I'm reminded. So you didn't want to take this gig, and you did it anyway.
Yes.
And there was this survivor guilt in the
Yeah.
space.
Yeah.
Um, and I think the survivor's guilt often turns into shame, into
Mhm.
something that is not expressed.
Yes. I think, yeah. And again, that's grief, right? So
Mm.
it's not unprocessed. When shame, blame, or guilt shows up, it's what are you trying not to feel? It's the grief. And
Mm.
one of the things in this particular organization is, they were trying to move right on to 2.0. They weren't taking time. It's the slowing down so that there can be an emptying out of grief. One of the places in work that we don't pay enough attention to is organizational grief.
Mm.
People will leave even for good reasons. They, retired or they got a new job, and we don't take time for the grief. And so what happens is organizations start to hear things like, well, so and so didn't do it this way because you're still holding on to so and so's way. It's a new person. I'm not that person, right? Or like there's this holding on or this not like resistance to the change because we haven't done the grief,
Mm.
so that there's room for the new to come in.
So how do you do grief?
Ah. I think one of the biggest misconceptions about grief is that we all grieve differently. I don't think that's true. I think we all avoid grief differently, and that story gives us permission to avoid it. But I think the grief is just letting your emotions flow through you. And I think that grief requires community. You have to know that somebody's there who won't let you drown in it. We're all afraid we'll drown in the grief. And so
Mm.
we'll never go to the bottom of the grief. If we're doing it by ourselves, we'll go right shy of the bottom and we'll come back. But until you go all the way to the bottom of the grief, you don't get access to the gifts that have come in with that grief. And and I love what Martin Prechtel, who's of my descent, has talked about around grief. He says, grief isn't sadness, grief is release. It's like when you're grieving the thing that you've got, or when you're grieving the thing that you've lost, we call it grief. When you're grieving the thing that you've got, we call it praise. But to really know how to praise something, you need to know what would be lost if it was gone.
Mm.
And I think about it as a sphere. If you think about your emotions in the sphere, if you're blocking the grief, you block the joy because it grows together. So all of my coaching clients know that I get real excited when they start crying or grieving because I know it doesn't come by itself. So many of us have had the experience of when you have a really good cry, oftentimes you'll start laughing or you feel so much better
Yes.
afterwards, right? Because
Yes.
it's you just opened up more access to the joy as you went deeper into the grief.
It's very interesting. I worked with plant medicine quite a lot recently. And when I have big, big cries,
Yes.
kind of intergenerational cries. And
Yes.
I've always found it difficult to explain what it is because it is not sadness.
No.
I'm
No.
not crying because I'm sad, and I'm crying all these tears for myself and all these generations.
You're
And
emptying
it's
out.
now that I understand. Yes,
Yeah.
it's grief. Um, thank you.
Welcome. It's the emptying out, whether that shows up as praise
Mhm.
or whether that shows up as what we typically think of as grief. It's just that emptying out. And I think so often we don't want to go into the grief because we're afraid of the suffering.
Mm.
But what I learned years ago is that grief doesn't require suffering. Grief is just sad. The suffering is the resistance to the grief.
Yes. Yeah. Because just crying tears is extremely relieving,
Yes.
and
Yes.
holding back and telling ourselves all these stories about these tears and the stories about the sadness. That's what hurts.
Yes. Or like that, just letting it flow through us. The other thing that I think is we just want to know too much. Sometimes like I want to know if I'm grieving, why,
Mm.
like what's happening. But I don't have to know to let it go.
Mm.
You know? I just, oftentimes if I find myself I start getting really weepy or grieving, I go into prayer, please help me not block this. Let it go. Just let it go. But we still want to figure everything out. We don't have to figure everything out to release it.
And yeah, and I think the what I realized over the past years, where also the medicine became easier and the release, was the moment that I allowed to feel with my body. Because
Yeah.
before, and I think I mentioned that so many times on the podcast, before when someone asked me, where do you feel it in your body? I would point at my head.
Yes.
I can
Yeah.
feel it right there because I can make sense of it. Um, but to actually use the embodied
Yes.
sense of grief and feelings, and then we don't need to understand.
Yes.
Um, we just need
Yeah.
to
Because it's
let
not an
it pass
intellectual
through.
exercise, right? It's not an intellectual exercise.
So, how does you said that you don't believe that there are different ways to grieve? There are only different ways to numb or avoid the grief. And I
Yes.
would be curious, so how do we grieve? And on three levels.
Hmm.
How do we grieve individually? How do we grieve on an organizational or on the collective level?
Hmm.
And how do organizations grieve?
Yeah. I think that, I've held lots of individuals and families and organizations in grief work. And part of it is just showing up for each other. We can create little rituals that are simple. I'm always looking for what's the lightest touch, to be together and to be able to speak or sometimes not speak. One of the rituals that I do with organizations often is I'll bring a bowl of water and I'll bring water soluble paper and have people write onto the paper what they're willing to let go of. And then we hold space for each person going to put it into the water. Now, they don't have to speak out what it is that they're to be witnessed in it, because some people are shy about sharing the details. But then what we ask is, I always ask, if you give something up, the universe hates a void. So then we're witnessed in speaking what we want to replace it in those moments, you know?
Which might be even more scary. Because the
Yeah.
moment we speak out what we want
Yeah.
and we're
We don't know
witnessed
how
by
it's
it,
going to come.
yeah,
not only
and
do we not only do we not know like how it's going to come, um but then it can be like, um mm, we can feel like we're exposed a bit, right? But I think there's ways to speak it in whatever layer of that we want to speak, that they're showing up for you
mm,
in that time, in that space. And part of it is, can we allow ourselves to have it? Uh,
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting. Yeah, now it's comes full circle because we only if we allow we can only allow ourselves to have it if we let go of the limiting beliefs that we are not good enough to have it, that
yeah,
we're not strong enough, that we're not supposed to, all these kind of things.
yeah.
So we cannot have it as long as this is blocking us. Um,
Part of my training includes integral theory and spiral dynamics, Don Beck's work on spiral dynamics and the evolution of consciousness. And one of the things that I added as a Black woman is I actually added an extra value meme at the bottom. And I call it a Black value meme because we are, I believe we're all born from a collective. And so we're birthed from the collective. So you come in belonging. And so then that changes the spiral because it means growth and development isn't individual, collective, individual, collective, individual, collective. Instead, then growth and development is collective, individual, collective, individual, collective, individual. And if you do that, you can align it with the chakras and you can see the evolution as we go up.
mm,
And I think if we really knew that we were birthed into the collective so that you cannot not belong, you come in belonging, it would change everything.
mm.
You know, one of the biggest needs for us as humans is the sense of belonging. What if you knew you could not belong? Then you would know that I could not belong.
Yeah, and I think that's the sad part about the missing initiation. What you mentioned before, that in today's societies, especially the non-black societies, if I understand you right,
I would
is
just say
that,
people of color. I wouldn't even just say Black societies. Yeah.
thank you, yeah, or let's say in societies where this collective is missing,
Yeah.
individual societies, let's call them individual societies,
Yeah.
um, where the initiation from adolescence to adulthood is missing in the collective and hence often done via trauma.
Yes.
This means that the memory we have is that when we grow up, we are by ourselves.
Yes. So trauma often makes us feel like the divine left us and that then we're responsible for our own survival. But I always say my survival is none of my business. Now, that doesn't mean I'm going to run out in the middle of the street in front of a car, but my job is to show up and to keep my promise of what I said I would do this lifetime.
Mm.
You know, but what I think happens then, this whole idea that we're responsible for our own survival makes us think that we can be independent. I think independence, or the idea of independence, is a trauma response. I think that we're all dependent. We're breathing the same air, we're drinking the same water, we're walking on the same earth. And so the question isn't whether or not we're independent or dependent. The question is, what kind of dependence are we? When
Mm.
we're standing in lack and scarcity, then we're codependents. When we're standing in love and abundance, then we're interdependent. But we're all always dependent. Now, you get to be an individual, you just don't get to be independent.
Mm. Mm. And then it's about finding the balance between autonomy and belonging.
Yes, yes, because each of us are needed. We each come with a unique genius in the world to solve an issue here. I think we are our most underutilized resource.
Mm.
You
Yeah.
know, I think we could solve all the issues on the planet by initiating all of the adults.
Mm.
And we're just not getting access to that. And so, you know, evolution knows we need to be initiated. So it keeps sending us things to try to initiate us.
And
And often I'll say, often what happens when the men aren't being initiated in a culture, wars will break out because
mm.
that trauma is a way of initiation.
So how can we help each other to find this initiation?
Well, the first thing I think is is you have to find it for yourself. We so think by saving the world we'll save ourselves, but it's only the opposite. By doing our own work, we are able to contribute in saving the world.
Mm.
I think I remember at one point a friend said to me, after some traumatic event, I just hope people will get up and go out and just serve and help and do all this stuff. I said, no, I hope they'll go the hell in. I hope they'll go into themselves so that we have more wisdom in the world. We said we don't have a lack of leaders. Leadership just means people are following you. It says nothing about where you're taking them. We have a lack of wise leaders, and wisdom comes through initiation.
I love this so much. And one thing that comes to my mind is, I would call it, for a lack of a better word, toxic activism.
Yes.
Of what I observe are many people going out with almost with rage
Yes.
and best intentions
Yes.
to save the world and to do good.
Yes.
And I think, yeah, you put it so, I haven't seen that. I think what is actually needed is that they first go inwards and heal themselves and then can become active in healthy activism.
I don't believe in a righteous anger. And there's lots of people who go out. Matter of fact, one of the activity because I work with a lot of activists, is I have them do this activity where they actually get to stand in front of a partner. And I have them first get a strong stance and then think about something that they hate. And I ask the person to try to push them over. And then I have them do it again and think of something that they love. And I have the person try to push them over. And it's much easier to push a person over when they're standing in something that they hate. Carolyn Mee says, we have got to move from the revolution into the involution. We have to stop revolting against what we don't want and start standing for what we do. That's the creating these new systems. I'm working with a university out in Oregon and California here in the US. And we're training med students in circle practice, Western University. They have created these care teams so the med students can hold each other. So hopefully they do more than just survive med school. They're working on the involution, not just the revolution. And this is our 5th year with these first year med students. We're training all first year med students in circle practice.
Beautiful.
So I've gotten past the 150. We trained 330 last year.
And this then helps them to hold themselves and each other.
Yes. And now what we're talking about is, what if we introduced it into the 3rd year when they start seeing patients? And so then we take circle, not just with them, but then implementing it into, how are you in a room with your patients and holding them? Yeah.
Can you, for those who are not familiar with circle practice,
Yes.
maybe give a little example of how it would look like being with each other with the practice or without?
Yes. And so some of the just like simple, again, what's the lightest touch? Some of the things we talk about is having a check-in question. And oftentimes people will think of icebreakers, but it's not an icebreaker. It's like moving from one of the, a check-in question, it invites a deeper level of conversation. So an icebreaker would be something like, what's your favorite ice cream? A check-in question could be, what's your favorite ice cream and why? It invites a deeper story, And so we talk about like a check-in question. Start with a check-in question. Just get everybody in the room. In community, we start in community and we end in community. And then we could have a talking piece that we pass around so everybody gets a chance. And then we have something in the center of the circle. Sometimes they don't. They're just, imagine the center of a circle that holds everything that has been said. So one of the things I love about circle is you don't have to answer somebody. If somebody says something, it's not asking for an answer. We just put everything into the center. And then the understanding can grow. And then do a checkout question. before you leave. And often a checkout question that I love is, what is a gift that you've received in this conversation today? And it can be as simple as that. But we need to be witnessed.
Mm.
And it's about, another elder, Jojo Palmaria, for me. Um, she used to say, she always says the world is out to gift me and not to get me. And she says that in the Bible where it says, thou shalt not bear false witness, it's like, it's not about just lying. It's about not bearing witness to each other, not witnessing each other. And I think about how much I do that every day. Like I'm busy or I'm doing something. And so I'm not like really witnessing. And I think it's about moving to like, how do I not just tell my story, but share my story? And I
Mm.
think there's a difference. Tell your story has all the details, and you can even have emotion with it when you're telling it. But sharing your story actually takes the person or the people there with you so they feel it in the way that your heart felt it. And we can develop our skill level in learning how to listen deep enough that you listen people into sharing their story, or sharing deep enough that I share people into listening to my story, into bearing witness, right? And when we can get to that level, both of us are transformed in the process.
Mm. Yeah, because the sharing means that you're giving away a part.
Yes, yes.
Mm. It's beautiful.
And we all know
And
people who tell their story over and over again. And we're like, oh my goodness, here's this story again. And I think it's because unconsciously we know our way out is our stories. Our way out is the sharing of the stories. But sometimes we can't make the leap from telling it to sharing it.
yeah, and I think it's because we do need the space to feel safe enough to share it and that the other person is also open to receive it because sharing is a two-way street. We cannot share if the other person doesn't receive. And I,
Well, unless we've developed our skill deep enough to share it into sharing them into witnessing.
mm,
That's what I'm saying is it can come from either side because we're connected. That's what it means to like, you can move things in three different ways. Body to body is force,
mhm,
mind to mind is persuasion,
mm,
and spirit to spirit is inspiration. You show up in spirit and share your story. And what happens is your heart speaks directly to theirs. Your souls are connected and it commands them to show up. They don't even have a choice whether to
mm,
come or not. Again, we'll say we're all connected, but what the hell does that mean in action? This is what it means.
yeah. And it's true, if we are sharing from our heart and with conviction, there is no escape. People will
Yeah.
receive it and will be present.
Yes.
Yeah. And I was thinking back to the example of the doctor with patients, and which is a beautiful example because I think that we forget that patients also very often just want to be witnessed. They don't need a response or an answer to everything they're saying. It's
Yeah.
simply, oh, I see you, I hear you.
Yes. Yes. Mm.
And speaking about the inner work, about grief and about healing, circling, what does it all mean for the DEI work?
Mm. I think we have forgotten that DEI is just about healing and wholeness. I think DEI people have forgotten that. I think again in this adolescent adult culture that we still want to make everybody else responsible for us. There's a group I was with, and one woman said to me, well, first of all, I was at this with this organization that was hosting a bunch of organizations, and the facilitators were having issues with the host of this gathering. And so they asked if me and one of my partners, this was not my, I was like, this was not my party. I was just going to present one piece of it. And they asked if we would um, be willing to mediate between them and the host. And my response to them was, well, let's take a break and we can, we'll come back. And they said to us, well, because they had been on a break, we didn't know if they were coming back. They actually had been off talking for like over 2 hours. And so they said, well, we really want to do it now. And I said, well, I need a couple minutes to powwow with my friend over here. And they were offended because I used the word powwow. And my response was, I said to them, well, that was not my intent. And that that we needed a couple of minutes. What I wanted to say to them is, you're asking me to save your ass. I don't need to be doing this, right? And the piece about like, we have gotten so like, your trigger is not my responsibility.
Mm.
Your trigger by definition is rooted in your past, not in that present moment. And so what we've done so often is we've set up systems where people half know them and they have used them to not take responsibility. I'm actually in the middle of creating racial healing essence cards.
Mm-hmm.
And it has things like that, like trauma. Like trauma is rooted in your past. So if you're telling me just for information's sake, okay. But that's not my responsibility in any way, shape, or form. That's for you to go heal. Or even pieces for me, like the whole thing we've gotten around with microaggressions. I'm like, do you know what the hell my ancestors went through? And this is what you're worried about? Or what condition the world is in now? And this is what's on your plate? I don't have time for that. Or even like for me, I think that around even like a lot of organizations, I don't do the pronoun thing. And I tell them I don't because we have forgotten that language is negotiated, not dictated. And so what we've taken away is the relationship. I have to be in relationship with you for it to be important enough for me to shift what I'm doing. But if you make it like it's automatic and there's no relationship, you're not changing anybody's minds or hearts. You're just speaking to the choir, or you're providing an opportunity for people to pretend that they get it and they're in it when they're not.
Mm.
I used to train HIV and AIDS instructors, and I said I think during the that time, first of all, I lost some loved ones who were HIV positive, and I think we lost a lot of the elders in that field in the world. And I think the conversations we've been having around gender and gender identity is often very adolescent.
What do you mean by that?
I mean that instead of saying to be a woman is all of these things or to be a man is all of these things, we've just othered everybody. And that seems very adolescent to me.
Mm.
And I'll say this because my son, a young gay man, and I were having a conversation and about queerness. And I said to him, if it was getting you what you say you want, I would be all for it. But I don't think it is. I think you're just speaking to the choir and you're leaving everybody else behind. And I said to him, because let's be really clear, if someone feels seen and heard and witnessed by you, they don't care what the hell you call them.
Yeah. Which then brings us back to the grief of the motivator of the anger. Because I think I agree that often we ask the wrong questions or we are leaning into the wrong conversations.
Yeah.
I wonder why gender is a topic in the workplace in the first place.
Yes.
I mean, whether I have a penis or a vagina is none of my bosses or my clients' business.
Yes.
It's like
Yeah.
my religion. What do you care?
Yes. Yes.
So I think it's a very personal thing. So why
Yes.
do we care actually? But I also might be ignorant of the importance um, for some people. And then I hear you that if they would feel listened and appreciated, acknowledged on other levels,
Hmm.
maybe the pronouns or the gender wouldn't be as important.
Yes.
Um,
Yes. I was on the board of a non for profit years ago, and there was a person there who wanted, at that time, wanted to be called it. And I said, there is no way with my ancestry that I'm ever going to do that.
mm,
And and I also said we spent here and had a conversation of about it was about an hour, 2 hour conversation about what this person wanted to be called when we couldn't pay our employees. And I think we've just gotten so off track, you know? And I think in this country, I'll say, I think it's easier to deal with conversations around gender than conversations around race. And I think a lot of people could feel really progressive because they're talking about gender
mhm.
because they don't really want to have the conversation around race
Why is that?
because I think we're so afraid of it. I think so often there hasn't been spaces where people have been grown up enough to hold it for us. I think we're having the wrong conversations often around race. I think most of us aren't mature enough to be in those conversations. And I think unconsciously we go into warrior archetype in those conversations. Which actually I think the warrior archetype is a real good archetype for the conversations. I just think most of us confuse warrior with soldier,
Mm,
where we haven't
mhm,
been, I see oftentimes, and for me, my job is to train warriors, to grow warriors, not to send you into war. People will go in and have the conversation. I don't have to do that.
mhm,
And the way I do that is actually I'm often trying to keep dialogue down and have people do practices that turn them back into themselves to, they can share their story and be witness, but it's not about like how the other people feel about your story. It's not about convincing them anything. Real warriors have a deep love and respect for the person on the other side. They know that they care about their cause just as much as you do yours.
mm,
Real warriors are willing to go in the mud and the dirt with you. They're willing to go into the hard places. Real warriors know that you can't get something new without giving up something old. And real warriors go into war mournfully. And I think all that stuff is really good for conversations around race, for lots of conversations, not just race. But I think that most of us aren't mature enough to be in those conversations. And we tend to have systems that throw people into those conversations without building those muscles.
mm. I can imagine that, and I think that the conversation in the having the conversation in the US would be is very different from having the conversation in Europe. I think,
Maybe. I don't know.
um,
I mean, yeah, I mean, knowing
or it
people,
depend. Yeah,
I think knowing people of color who live in Europe, I don't know
mm,
if that's true.
yeah, true, true. And then yeah, true. I wonder whether there's so much guilt and shame
Yeah.
again associated with it. Um, and then I would be curious how this then relates to grief.
Yeah.
Um, and also, so for instance, I think for me, I feel very vulnerable in these conversations because I realize that I'm not aware of all the I'm using the wrong language.
Well, I
Um,
think,
I'm not aware how I am supposed to, and I'm not aware of all the feet that I can step on. Um,
yeah.
and I think this makes me then rather maybe avoid the conversations because I'm like, I don't want to come across as a person who's ignorant or racist or whatsoever just because I'm using the wrong language. And I think this is again also a result of asking the right question and putting emphasis and anger and activism onto the wrong things because it shouldn't be like that.
Well, I think that it's because they're not warriors holding the conversation
Mm,
or in the conversation. Because again, this piece about can we give some each other some grace
mm,
to be in the conversation? We're all going to screw up. We're all going to say the wrong thing at a time. Can we just take, if we're not willing to do that, we can't have the conversation, And I think there's a piece where, like, even, I hear a lot, especially from people of color, that we don't want to carry the emotional labor. And what my elders have taught me is the responsibility is always with the one most healed. There's people who are more healed than you that are carrying it for you too. How else do we expect people to get to know things? But I think in so many spaces we've been so betrayed in these spaces, all of us, no matter what your race or background is, in these conversations with people who haven't done their own healing to hold the depth of those conversations. And so they go sideways and then people are hurt. And so, again, the fear of saying those things come from past experience and what you're afraid might happen in the future.
how? And then how can we have these conversations that are needed?
Yes.
Um, Acknowledging that most of us are actually not mature enough or to have them.
So that's why I have slightly different conversations. So it's not really a conversation. Like I said, I try to keep people out of dialogue. I mean, we do talk about what you're noticing, but it may be I set up a trio, and one person's job is to tell the story that may be connected to race or
Mm,
whatever. The other person is just deep listening, open heart, open mind, open spirit. They're not to say anything, they just deep listening and witnessing. And then the other person I might ask to harvest what they're hearing that may be connected to, like, one of the things I'll do is class. So, like, one example I'll use is that police here will say they go into poor neighborhoods and they're breaking down doors and stuff like that because of high substance abuse, high alcohol abuse, high, what is it, domestic violence. But we all know those conditions exist in every college campus across country, and they're not breaking down those doors. So that's an instance of class
mm,
that's affecting that story. And so they listen for something like that. And then what we do is I ask all the people who shared your story, how did it feel to be listened to? I don't want to hear your story. We're not sharing the stories here. You already shared your story. I want to know how it feels because we need to know what we're asking of people when we're asking them to share their stories. And then I ask, so how did it feel to just listen and not to give advice, not to interrupt, not to just listen with open heart, open mind, open spirit? And then I asked for anyone who was the harvester. What did you notice? What were the places of class? And so it's an experience that's not a dialogue. And, they'll go into those conversations more by themselves, but they're more strengthened. We're building warriors to then be in those conversations. We're trusting that they will have those conversations with friends and families whenever, that I don't have to do that.
mm.
I'm preparing them better to be in the conversations.
I love that. And I can see how this will affect them ways beyond these conversations. Because these are meta skills that um, we do need in general to create compassion and healing.
Yeah.
And
One,
how would you, if you had a magic wand and could redesign the DI space,
yeah,
how
yeah,
would the DI work look like? Because I mean, it is a huge crisis at the moment. We are recording in March 2025.
yes. Yes. I think first it's so often, hmm, just because you know something intellectually doesn't mean you know it.
Mm.
And, or that you've done your own work around it, your own internal work, you know. Um, I think it's the piece of it's really getting that it's ultimately about health and wholeness. It's about compassion. We have forgotten the connection between compassion and doing our own grief work, our own healing work. If, most of us would consider ourselves pretty compassionate people. And to a certain extent, we would be right. But if you haven't done your own healing, your own depth work, your compassion has no depth. It's very shallow. Because if you don't have it for you, you can't give it to another.
Same as with love. I think I had a big aha moment and I need to double check with you.
Yes. Yes.
So, when you said that shame and guilt always come back to grief,
Mhm.
and when I mentioned that a big obstacle to the conversations around race is shame and guilt, and then in your language or in your model, this would be boiled down to grief. So, what
Mhm.
I just realized is, and I wonder, does it mean the grief for ourselves? Maybe the, oh, I have been suppressed too. I have been discriminated too. All of these kind of small things where we felt kind of where we felt being wronged and
Yeah.
first have to grieve for that it's okay. So I grieve for these moments of acknowledgement, appreciation that I haven't had. And only if I have healed on these small moments, then I can really be in the conversation with someone of color and the trauma and the pain that they have suffered. Is this what
Yes.
you mean?
So, yes. And this is why when Amy and I, our book, The Underground Railroad, um, remembering, um, remembering soul and spirit, a journey to remembering soul and spirit, is written by me as a woman of color and her as a white woman. And it's not about reconciliation between us, it's reconciliation within each of us. So she's doing her own healing and I'm doing my own healing. And then we take you through a 40-day journey to do your own healing, because it's the piece, again, you can't give what you don't have. And so, it's these spaces have to be able to be spaces where we all can grow our internal powers.
Yeah. And I think, and it's such a delicate space because to admit the very human emotion of, but I too, I
Yeah.
have been discriminated as I've been bullied at school. Yes, and everyone's trauma and situation is their own. And I think then to overcome, to acknowledge that it's okay to have that individually, and
Yes.
to grieve over that. And it does not mean
Well, I,
that.
I think it's, uh,
So, and what I mean by that is, I think that this shame around that is in the way to really have the conversation and to really
yes,
understand the magnitude of racism
yes,
and what people of color are until today going through.
yes. And
And it's just self-protection, which is so human and so sad.
yes. And I'll say one of the things that, Amy writes in the book, that I think is one of the most powerful lines. She says one of the hardest things for her to heal as a white woman is, she says, we have been purveyors of half truths and willful not seeing.
Mm,
And, and I think that that's a hard thing. It's a hard thing. And until we can be in spaces, I think the warrior archetype, like I said, has really good gifts for these conversations. I just think that, one of the things that is helpful in these conversations is a warrior goes into war mournfully. The warrior archetype isn't successful if they go into battle. They're only successful when they don't,
Mm. Mm.
you know? Knights are different. They're successful when they go in the battle and they win, but a warrior isn't. And so these pieces are out like, how do we grow that strength? How do we invite people into listening, invite people in knowing in this time our job is to grow our capacity to include as many truths in our assessment of what is true as possible. In a time where we talk about you have your truth, I have my truth, they have their truth, we can start to believe there's no ultimate truth, but there is. And if our job then is growing our capacity to include as many in our assessments, which we'll never reach, you know, that's the job. Like, how do we open up, oh, to include theirs and include theirs in our assessment now?
Yeah. And then, if I understand you correctly, then the real DI work that needs to be done is actually the growing real compassion.
Yes.
Um,
For self,
yes,
love and compassion for self, because if you
because
don't have that for yourself, you can't give it to me.
exactly. So for self, and then it will and then we have space for compassion and love for others. And then we have also, if we have curiosity for self, we have
Yes.
curiosity for others.
The,
And then
the
it's not about the labels and ticking the boxes.
yes. The other thing I'll say is we're such an entitled people that people have the right to be as prejudiced as they want to be. Now, behavior is different, but what we've moved to try to do is to shift where like to think that we have the right to tell someone where they should be, and we don't. If you want freedom to decide what you believe, then the other people have freedom to decide what they believe. And I think so often in this time, we're trying to dictate what people should believe. And that's not our lane. Now we can dictate behavior, but
And
we
try.
can't. Well, we can. I mean, we can have boundaries around behavior. But even that, people have choice. That's why I say the relationship piece, the fact that we're pulling out more and more of the relationship pieces, we're finding more and more reasons not to be together in person. We're going to more automated systems. My someone who works for me put together a video for my Instagram, and he like waited for me to see it because it was a wonderful video about the boys book that I've written, and had my voiceover in it, but it wasn't me. It wasn't me reading it. I mean, he had gotten my voice from several Zoom calls, and then told it what it wanted me to say, and it sounded like me, and it took pauses and kind of the places I take pauses, but it wasn't me. I trust him to put words in my mouth like that, but
It's
but
scary.
when we're in a place that's finding more opportunities for us not to be together in person, and when your likeness and your voice can be used to look real and sound real, we're creating a clash that I don't know if we're really prepared to. I said it's like we're giving 2-year-olds the keys to the car.
Yeah, that's actually what's happening right now with AI.
Yeah.
Mm. So, what we need is more time for community and
Yes.
introspection.
Yes. Yeah, to know each other.
Mm.
There I saw on, I think it was Facebook recently, someone posted that people are calling, and so when you pick up the phone, they say something. They say hello, and then you say hello, and they say, "Can you hear me?" And when you say yes, they record your voice.
What?
They'll record the yes and then can use the yes for other things.
That is insane.
Yeah, we have the capacity to do that now.
Mm.
Yeah.
And I was just reflecting that, observe that we are so busy with back to back. Well, when I say we, I luckily don't include myself, so I don't want to say we. What I observe is that many who are caught in the corporate space, they have back to back meetings, rush through all of that. And then there's no time for a quick alignment to have a real conversation when it's needed, because,
Yes. Yes.
and then everything has to happen, everything in between that actually needs alignment
Yeah.
needs to happen via email, which is full of opportunities for miscommunication,
Yes.
misalignment, because we don't have the tone. And then we sit in the meetings replying to the emails that should have
Yeah.
been the meetings.
Yes.
And everything goes cricket.
Yeah. I actually think the back to back meetings are very violent. I think that it's to us to be in
Mm.
that kind of, just to even be in the screen like that, and to, and I think we just carried it over from COVID time. And I just think it's not kind to each other, to our bodies, to relationship.
Yeah. And we have now, I think, spoken for almost 2.5 hours,
Yeah.
of which we recorded a bit more than 1 hour.
Yeah.
And and I think, so I am very fortunate and privileged that I can have these deep conversations and that you also took the time. And I think it's something that we forget that it's available to us if we're not reminded,
Yes.
and how
Yes, that we have
precious it is.
choice.
Yes.
Choice. Often tell people, go in your calendar and even after every meeting, block some time off. I'm blessed enough that this is my only call today,
Mm.
and I pay attention to that. I pay attention to, um, but I've worked in a way and have built my work in a way that I can do that. Now, does this happen every day? No. Some days I have, but I usually don't do more than 3 or 4 calls in a day if I have to, you know. And so I know it's not always possible, and I'm not, um, again, speaking to other people's situations. I'm just saying we always have choice in some way, shape, or form of how we arrange it for ourselves and what works for us.
And looking at myself in my calendar, I came to the conclusion that I have to ask myself the difficult, uncomfortable question: what am I avoiding by putting so many meetings into my calendar?
Yeah.
And once I ask that question and then look at, okay, are all these meetings actually necessary? And what am I not doing by having them? And why am I not doing it? Oh, it's so good to have an excuse not to write on my
Yes.
book, not to
Yeah.
do the self care, not to do the thinking work.
I always say the work is kind, it'll wait. It's like it'll sit on my desk forever, right? Or need to be scheduled forever. And grown ass people can take care of themselves. That's not my responsibility. It's to get really clear about what is it that I need and that works well for me and that still allows me to be in service in good ways.
And I wish that we'll use all the AI capacities for actually that for once.
Yes. Yes. And that's
Uh,
what we're trying to do, in the ways that we're using it. I can't, um, again, I have no say over how someone else uses it. I can only speak to how I'm using it. And like I said, the person who is doing that stuff for me is my cousin. And I know he loves and cares about me, and I love and care about him. And so there's trust between us. And so I trust him to do that. And he sends all the stuff to me before he posts it anyway, usually. That time he didn't because he just wanted to see what I said, what I was going to say.
yeah.
Mm,
And and now an entire different angle, and maybe that's a conversation that we will have in the future, is how to create compassion to AI and how to create relationship to AI. And the reason why I'm saying that is I'm reading this book at the moment. Super intelligent? No, Mo Gutbert. And he explains that the way we must see AI is like an infant growing up and learning from whatever we are teaching them. So the times are over where our chat GPTs are responding to an algorithm. No, they're responding to the global community and what they are feeding into it. So what the way how we are treating them is the
Yes.
way that they will grow up and believe that we are speaking. Because if they are just taking in and replicating whatever they see, if they believe it's normal to bully each other,
Hmm.
then this is what they think that we want to hear.
Well, and I think I've had, conversations with people about AI, about the information that we have is still predominantly Eurocentric information.
Mm,
Because those are the people who typically, now it's changing because of self-publishing, but have been published and all this thing, this stuff. And so being aware that just because we have sources that are taking this data in doesn't mean it's non-biased data.
mm.
Uh,
Yes. Um, and very quickly, everything that it will learn, since its access to AI has been democratized
yes,
because
yes,
everyone with a phone now can use it.
yes,
So the information we're feeding it
yes, yes.
is,
That's what I said. I think it's changing,
yes.
you know.
And that's beautiful and
Yeah,
that's dangerous because what are we feeding it?
yes,
And how we, yeah, how do we treat it and how do we expect it to treat us back in the future?
yeah,
It's a future conversation.
yes. We'll see.
Yeah. Yeah. So I say thank you to my AI.
Yeah.
Engage in beautiful conversations.
Yes. I know I've been having these, I guess, they're full moon conversations with a woman from India and a gentleman from Europe. And for over about a year now, I guess we've been on these calls. And he took some of our conversations and had a conversation with AI about it and asked them what it was noticing. Because the conversation actually is about resourcing. Like, how are we resourced in our practice and in our eldering?
Mm-hmm.
And it was quite something to like hear his conversation or see the transcript with AI to just like what I told him. It was like really exciting and pretty freaky. It's both at the same time. Again, it's all of it, right?
Yeah.
And we'll see
Yeah.
how we navigate this. I think what's happening though is always when there's systems that are being hospiced out, there are systems that are being birthed in.
Mm.
And I would guess it would be all of it again. There would be some that are really good and some that aren't. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Quanita.
You're so welcome. So good to be in conversation with you.
Missed that. It's been a while.
It has. The first time we had a conversation, it was a while before we got that one done. And so I was going back and listening to that first one. You're like, oh, I mean, we'd been trying for over a year, I think, to
Yes,
connect. And so, so we have to be more frequent than this, though.
I think so too. And I had to smirk, to laugh when you mentioned that you know that we are not human beings with a spiritual experience, but spiritual beings with a human experience. Because at our very first conversation, you were still sitting on the question,
Yes.
sitting with the question, not on the
Yes.
question. Yes.
Now, it's so interesting. I wonder if the shift wasn't that I was still sitting with the question, but whether I was less willing to claim it,
Mm.
to allow other people to still sit with the question.
Haha.
You know, nowadays I think I'm, and I have been for a while, but more willing to put a stake in the ground
Mm.
and really be clear that people still get to choose whatever works for them. You know, but I get to stand in where I am and know that in any moment I can move the stake.
If
Thank you
there's
for your hospitality and your invitation.
mm. Thank you for your wisdom. Mm. Dup, 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 dup.